one of my favorite people in the English Reformation. He was not a fan of Queen Mary. He was a big fan of Queen Elizabeth. Yay. 1516, he's born in Lincolnshire. Gets his bachelor's and master's degrees at Oxford and then becomes a lecturer there.
You know what his bachelor's degree was in?
I think it was logic, but I could be wrong.
A friend of mine's daughter is thinking about going to Oxford.
1545, he resigned from Oxford after becoming a Protestant. This underlines the fact that Henry VIII really wasn't a Protestant. He wanted to pull away from the Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, but he really wasn't a Protestant, and so people still had to do stuff like that. Matter of fact, Henry VIII was ordering Lutherans to be hunted down and burned, even after he pulled away from the Catholic Church. 1547, he marries Agnes Randall. And in January 1547 was probably the biggest moment of his life. Up to that point, pro-Protestant Edward VI becomes king. Now, we haven't talked about Edward VI yet, but he is on our list in the top 10. I forget what number. And Edward VI is the first king of England who was Protestant from birth. He was actually raised as a Protestant. June 24th, 1550, Foxe is ordained as a deacon. And then, if we had a soundtrack to this course, it would go dum da dum dum. John Foxe's forward motion ended in July of 1553 when Bloody Mary, Queen Mary I, becomes Queen of England. July 1554, fearing persecution, Foxe sailed to Europe, and he made his first attempt at publishing a history of Christian persecution. This was not yet Acts and Martyrs, the book he would become so famous for. It was kind of a cliff notes of what would later be the work he became so famous for. 1554, he becomes a preacher for English refugees in Frankfurt. 1555, he worked as a proofreader. I get a kick out of stuff like that. Here's maybe the most famous author of the English Reformation, and he had to work for a proofreader to have enough to eat while he was in Europe or something like that. 1556, he publishes a Latin drama called Christus Triumphans. 1558, Mary I dies, and the glorious Queen Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England, and Foxe returns to London. March 20th, 1563, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, also known as Acts and Monuments, is published by John Day, and it is 1,800 pages long. 1,800 pages long.
I wouldn't want to see that.
350 pages of Churchill's books. Jeez.
May 22nd, 1563, is the appointed prebend of Shipton in Salisbury Cathedral by Elizabeth I. You see, he's already getting the benefits of having a Protestant queen on the throne. 1570, the second edition of his Book of Martyrs is published. 1571, and this is a good gig if you can get it. The Church of England orders that Foxe's Book of Martyrs be placed in every cathedral church in England. I think the Church of England should order that every one of my Sunday school courses be placed in every church.
Here.
Thank you very much. 1583, the final printing of his Book of Martyrs. In his lifetime, it was 4,000 pages long. And he dies in England in 1587. So, why is he on the list? He wrote one book, whoopee. Well, it's because of the impact of that book, and I would say certainly into the 1960s, 1970s, and the impact of that book was still pretty strong in England. I think it's dropped off a bit since the Irish troubles have ended, but it was still a pretty influential book. He's a commoner. He writes what would be the seminal book of the English Reformation, Acts and Monuments. Luther wrote his commentary on Romans. Calvin wrote his Christian Institutes. The Methodists, or the Mennonites had their can't think of the name. Their big book on the martyrs. Can you remember the name? Well, they had a big book on the martyrs too.
Big book of dead Mennonites.
And the English had. While Foxe covered martyrs from all ages, the book's strongest content has to do with the English martyrs who suffered under Catholic rule from the time of the Lollards. They were the Wycliffe's followers through the reign of Mary Tudor. And a matter of fact, the largest section of the book is the martyrs under Bloody Mary, under Mary Tudor. And he, of course, had personally experienced the latter period, so it was longer and had much more detail.
Martyr's Mirror.
Martyr's Mirror, thank you very much. That was the Mennonite Anabaptist book, Martyr's Mirror, which I've actually read from cover to cover. I will admit I have not read Acts and Monuments from cover to cover. I certainly have read the parts of Acts and Monuments that have to do with Queen Mary's reign.
You could read 100 pages a night and take you over a year to read.
Foxe's book has had a huge impact on the English church for hundreds of years. As I said, it's probably tailed off a little bit now. But his book is really an anti-Catholic diatribe, and it kind of kept anti-Catholic sentiment in England was sort of whipped up, not just for decades, but for hundreds of years. I mean, Ian Paisley, who we talked about, he was number 25 on our list. Ian Paisley used to refer to acts and monuments to describe the perfidy of Catholic rulers. I remember reading this book as a teenager, which tells you something about what my sowing my wild oats was about. And I remember being not just engrossed in the stories of the three Protestant bishops who were executed by Queen Mary, but being indignant about it. And the three, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer. And Cranmer is the most important one, and I think he's number 2 on our list, and we will talk about him in some detail. That is a engraving from a 1563 edition of Acts and Monuments, and it shows Ridley and Latimer being burned at the stake by Bloody Mary.
Oh, dude, yeah.
We haven't got to Queen Elizabeth yet, who was number 1 on our list. However, John Foxe was a big fan of Queen Elizabeth, and even though she was not martyred by her sister treated her meanly, and that got a number of pages in Acts and Monuments, so I wanted to share some of these. Oh, I love this. The preservation of Princess Elizabeth may be reckoned a remarkable instance of the watchful eye which had the church. So in other words, she survived Mary's reign, and so that was because Christ was watching over the church. The bigotry of Mary regarded not the ties of consanguinity, of blood ties, of natural affection, of natural succession. Her mind, physically morose, was under the dominion of men who possessed not the milk of human kindness, and whose principles were sanctioned and enjoined by the idolatrous tenets of the Romish pontiff. You're getting the idea that he wasn't a big fan of either Mary or of Catholics in general. But they had foreseen the short date of Mary's reign. They would have stained their hands in the Protestant blood of Elizabeth. As if Providence had the perpetual establishment of the Protestant faith in view, the difference of the durations of the 2 reigns is worthy of notice. So he's pointing out the fact that Bloody Mary only reigned 4 years, and of course, Elizabeth I reigned for decades in what was the golden age of England. Mary might have reigned many years in the course of nature, but the course of grace had willed it otherwise. 5 years and 4 months was the time of persecution allotted to this weak, disgraceful reign, while that of Elizabeth reckoned a number of years among the highest of those who have sat on the English throne, almost 9 times that of her merciless So this gives you an idea of what I was talking about. Foxe was not a big fan of Mary or of Catholics. Before Mary attained the crown, she treated her with sisterly kindness, but from that period her conduct was altered and her most imperious distance substituted. Remember, Mary is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, so they are half-sisters, same father, different mothers. And Anne Boleyn was a Protestant. She was probably a practicing Lutheran during the time she was married to Henry VIII, who technically was out busy killing Lutherans during that same time.
Well, he got around to her too, so.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Heresy, treason, whatever the other charges were.
And no son.
No son. Though Elizabeth had no concern in the rebellion of Sir Thomas Wyatt, which was a rebellion against Mary at the beginning of her reign, yet she was apprehended and treated as a culprit in that commotion. The manner, too, of her arrest was similar to the mind that dictated it. The 3 cabinet members whom she deputed to see the arrest executed rudely entered the chamber of the princess at 10 o'clock at night. And though she was extremely ill, they could scarcely be induced to let her remain till the following morning. So, Latimer and Ridley and Cranmer were burned at the stake. Princess Elizabeth was treated rudely.
Frank does have his privileges.
Her enfeebled state permitted her to be moved only by short stages in a journey of such length to London, but the princess, though afflicted in person, had a consolation in mind which her sister never could purchase. The people through whom she passed on their way pitied her and put up her prayers for her preservation. And supposedly the streets were lined on her journey, and there were people cheering as her carriage went by. Arriving at court, she was made a close prisoner for a fortnight without knowing who was her accuser or seeing anyone who could console or advise her. The charge, however, was at length unmasked by Gardiner, who with 19 of the council accused her of abetting Wyatt's conspiracy, which she religiously affirmed to be false. Failing in this, they placed against her the transactions of Sir Peter Carow in the West, in which they were as unsuccessful as in the former. The Queen now signified it was her pleasure that she should be committed to the Tower, a step which overwhelmed the princess with the greatest alarm and uneasiness. In vain she hoped the Queen's Majesty would not commit her to such a place, but there was no leniency to be expected. Her attendants were limited, and 100 northern soldiers appointed to guard her. So of course, by all these guards, Elizabeth was every bit as in line for the throne as Mary was, and would have been a threat to her the whole time. I really enjoyed, and I took a very edited version of his long discussion of the indignities that Princess Elizabeth had to suffer under her nefarious sister. But I kind of get a kick out of it. He spent so much time talking about this, and they were rude to her, and this sort of thing. Well, Mary killed a bunch of people, including a bunch of bishops, but he seemed more indignant that they were rude to Elizabeth. But that's John Foxe. He's in here entirely because of one book that he wrote, but it was a book that had a tremendous influence on England, literally for hundreds of years.